This is County Historian Larry Tippin. We've been doing a series on tiny towns and vanished villages of Putnam County. And the one we're going to talk about today meets the description of both. It was never more than just a few houses, and it's long, long gone. Most people have never heard of it. The north central Putnam County, called Swanksville, founded by David Swank, who was one of the earliest settlers in the northern part of the county. He came about 1820 and believed to have built a cabin in northeastern Russell Township at that time. But if he did come in 1820, it would have been after August the 7th of that year, because we find him in the census in Hardin County, Kentucky. At that time, the census records before 1850 only showed the head of the household and then the people in the house by age group. So if he came to Putnam County, it was after that in 1820. It may have been 1821, but he was definitely one of the first settlers in northern Putnam County. Let's look at a map from 1864. This is the top or northern part of Russell Township. We see Russellville over here, and then Swanksville. You won't find Swanksville, I don't think, on any map, but we've been able to determine where it was through various records. I want to draw your attention first, this area right here, zoom in on it. It says Benjamin Walden, one of the first settlers in the county. And we've never heard about this Benjamin Walden. Interestingly enough, this 1864 map has a few instances of people where they say were the early settlers. And if they're still alive in 1864, that's noted, and he's one of them. But we'll talk about him on a different day. We're talking about Swanksville today. In the 1879 Historical Atlas of Putnam County, we see this section in Russell Township. It's saying Russell Township is one of the first settled. David Swank, who came in 1820, built his cabin on what is still known in the neighborhood as the Swank Farm in the northeast part of the county, was the first settler. Now, what's interesting about this 1879, it's the first real history or compiled history of the county, but it didn't cite its sources, and we're not so sure if all the dates are accurate, but it's probably the next best of the sources we have. We really consider the primary source, because by definition it's not contemporaneous. It wasn't written close to 1820, and it didn't cite the sources. But it does say with great authority that David Swank was the first settler in Russell Township, even before the Sutherlands, the Wilsons, the Forges, Blakes, Clodfelders, and so forth. And this is the record of the land patents compiled a few years back, showing when the settlers applied for the land patent. It would usually take a year or so for it to be processed, but this is the actual date of the application of David Swank on May 27th, 1823, in the east half of the southeast quarter, section 1 of Russell Township. And this is the actual land patent itself. It's hard to read. It's 80 acres. Issued on April the 1st, 1824 was the issue date. Land patents are very interesting. They're available online now through the Bureau of Land Management. It's kind of hard to find, but if you can drill through it, you can find them. It's very neat to find the land patents. Land patents were the first deed or the first transfer of property from the United States government after they acquired land through the various treaties to the first settlers, usually for $1 an acre, $1 a quarter an acre, so forth. This is an interesting map I'm going to show you. It's copyrighted in 1833, compiled before that by the Department of Natural Resources, showing the influence of the Indian upon our history, the Indian names and the French names. One of the significant things we see here in West Central Indiana from Thorntown all the way down to about Terre Haute and partially along Big Raccoon Creek was a very significant Indian trail. Then went on the Putnam County part of it. The portion in blue is the northern part of Russell Township we've been looking at roughly. And we see that the name came from an Indian name called Shikoya or something like that, probably not pronouncing exactly right, which roughly translates to lean raccoon, which is where we got the name for Raccoon Creek. Then you see this Wea settlement and a prominent trading post up at Newport on the Wabash River. Let's go back to the 1864 map. So again, a broad view. We'll zoom in a second. So again, we see Russellville. And then we see a road that comes across, which is more or less now US 236, but this road goes way down here to Raccoon Creek before it goes back up, and there's nothing in between. And the Skillman Cemetery is marked. One of the things that we do research, we find a cemetery, we see it's accurately marked. It's a really good reference point because it's not going to go anywhere. It may expand, but it's not going to go anywhere. This is a small cemetery, I think 100 barrels, maybe a little less. And it's been there since the early days. And then you'll see this road that comes up from the south was the early mail route road, some called Tavern Road, that connects the taverns and inns of the various communities, called Tavern Road or Stagecoach Road, if you prefer. Goes up from Blakesburg and Cairo. There's a man. And then you see that it comes up, meets this road that comes from here, just south of the Skillman Cemetery. Then it goes across this Raccoon Creek, goes a little bit to the east and then north. Then it goes due north, and that's the only north-south road in central Putnam County in the early days, 1820s, 1830s, and into the 1840s a little bit. The road that we now call US 231, formerly State Road 43, did not exist in 1823, 1824, the 1830s. This was the only road that went north and south. Then we see that this road that comes up past the Skillman Cemetery and going north. It's very interesting. These two roads don't match up. This isn't a typo on the map. This is really what happened. This road that came from Franklin Township, which is in green, to Russell Township, which is in red, those roads did match. It came to a certain point, went up. Then there's another road that went up here, went around this very steep ravine to just south of the Skillman Cemetery and met up with the road that came up from Blakesburg and Cairo. You see the Skillmans. And then Cornelius Swank. Cornelius Swank was the son of David and Elizabeth Swank, went on to become a prominent Methodist minister. And his sister Elizabeth married William Skillman. So this was the Swank's property. You see there's one home here, another one up here, right along this road. Now this is interesting to lay down what's now US 236 on top of that map. So you see with this road that came in from Franklin Township as it went to Russell, this white line is the township line. Then you get in Russell Township, it goes up here and goes across. And you can still see what looks like a gravel driveway to nowhere in the middle of a cornfield to the end of this road. And you might think this is a fence road, but it's not. It's a graded road. You can see that it was clearly the road. And then it went around this very steep ravine. And then again, it met up with this road that came up from Blakesburg and Cairo, just south of the Skillman Cemetery. In fact, you can see where this road continues because it's a driveway to this little white house here. Then it went down and then across, and you can see where the roadway went down this hill toward Raccoon Creek. It's very neat to to see this. On this map then, what we've gone back to the 1864, and this green is more or less the current US 236. It comes across here, then down. And then right where this roadway angled down near this very steep ravine, you can see where it came out and actually went across parts of what's now 236. And you can clearly see it. You can see it better when the leaves are off in the winter and early spring, but you can clearly see where that roadway came down and that steep ravines just to the side here. And then here's another interesting map. It's a poster out from 1912, and it shows who's delivering the mail, who's carrying the mail. You can see Lockridge, Skillman, Raccoon, of course, Nichols, Wilson's, Peffley, the names you'd expect. And even in 1912, what's now US 236 did not exist. There's no road here. But you can see a dot on the map on the road that went up. This road that came up from Blakesburg, Cairo, across Raccoon Creek, then met this road as it went north. Talk about the post office. Swanksville was first named Newcastle. Plotted out March 16, 1829 by David Swank. He put it in a deed book A, the very first deed book, but he never transferred it over to the regular plat books. There's a series of plat books. The first one starts with Greencastle, but it's still in deed book A, and it's called Newcastle. That's what David Swank called it. But they needed to establish a post office, and the post office department said you can't do that because there's already a Newcastle in Indiana. So since David Swank is the one that applied for it, they named it after him, called the post office Swanksville. So he had a Swanksville post office in Newcastle. What's interesting is we don't see that David Swank was ever appointed postmaster. We went to the National Archives. In this case, went to Atlanta. We could have went to Denver, the nation's capital, but went to Atlanta. And we looked through the early appointments of postmasters from the very beginning, all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia, and so forth. And we scoured Putnam County. We found that the first post office in Putnam County was Greencastle in 1824. Although it's said that Greencastle may have been a satellite post office for the Vincennes post office prior to 1824. The second one was Blakesburg in 1828, and the third one was Swanksville, with the appointment of Nathaniel Parker, June the 8th, 1829. And again, we never could find that David Swank was ever the postmaster. It's very, very remote, but still possible that we might have missed it. But we went through this many, many, many times, line by line, very carefully. So it looks like either it was Swank's post office, that Nathaniel Parker was the only postmaster at Swanksville post office. And then various historical records indicated that David Swank moved the post office to Parkersburg in Montgomery County, probably about 1832. And actually was a small building, maybe 6 by 6, 8 by 8, something like that, near his mill. It wasn't in the mill, but it was near the mill. And we wanted to move it to Parkersburg. He physically loaded the post office, the building, onto a wagon and moved it to Parkersburg, a couple of miles to the northeast. And then we see that Nathaniel Parker was reappointed postmaster, now called Parkersburg, in 1835. So it looks like the post office at Swanksville was moved to Parkersburg, but it was still called Swanksville until 1835. Now, Parkersburg was interesting. It was originally called Shucktown for Daniel Shuck, who is the primary owner. Even though this isn't in Putnam County, it's close enough. We'll say something about it. And then the post office at Parkersburg was renamed Faithville in early January of 1837. And then by June of 1837, it was named Parkersburg again, with Zachariah Bailey being appointed postmaster. So it's kind of interesting how this happened. I'm not sure why, but then the community came to be known as Parkersburg after the post office. Let's talk about the Skillman Cemetery. Again, a lot of our history we can get from the cemeteries. We see that David Swank and his wife Elizabeth are buried at what's called the Skillman Cemetery, just south up the hill from the old community of Swanksville, as are a number of their descendants, including their daughter Elizabeth, who had married William Skillman. Then we see David died in 1842 and Elizabeth in 1851. The most prominent tombstone in the Skillman Cemetery is this one of William Skillman, a son-in-law of the Swanks, and then Elizabeth, who was a Swank. So since this is the most prominent stone and it says Skillman, people have called it the Skillman Cemetery, although it probably should more accurately have been called the Swank Cemetery, after David and Elizabeth Swank, who were buried just to the south of the Skillmans. So let's go to some newspapers. So it's fun to read newspapers. It's also important to note the primary source from the secondary source newspapers, the distinguish between those two. This is 1831 in the Wabash Herald. And let's see what's going on here. It's very interesting. This guy, this lady or Lane, however you pronounce it, is going to run a lottery. And here's his scheme. He's going to advertise that he's going to give prizes up to $2,000, cash, land, livestock, and so forth. And you can get a ticket at $2 a piece at Russellville, Rockville, so forth, so on, and Swanksville. So this is the first reference we actually see as Swanksville in the newspapers. It's very interesting. And I don't know if he sold his 1,000 tickets or so to break even. He ran this advertisement at least a dozen times in the summer and fall of 1831, but we didn't see any follow-up. So I don't know if he sold enough tickets to make it successful. This is a very interesting newspaper, but it's a secondary source because it's 1899 out of Crawfordsville. So it's just 80 years later. So I'm going to zoom in on this. We put some of it together. Sometime in the summer of 1824, David Swank on Raccoon Creek, really south of Parkersburg and a little west, entered a piece of land and put up a grist mill run by water of Raccoon Creek. He constructed a dam in the creek and then had a mill. And it said that this mill was a significant improvement because prior to that, the boys and girls, the teenagers, let's keep them out of trouble by letting them by hand pound the corn on a hominy mill or hominy block. So having an actual grist mill is a significant improvement over that. I don't know what kind of trouble the kids got into after this, but it took a long time to do this before they had the mill. The article goes on to continue. The Chief Peter Cornstalk took his corn to Swanksville to have it ground. This is very significant. So even though it's a secondary source, they're noting that Chief Cornstalk started taking his corn to Swanksville, which was about 4 miles or so southwest of his Indian village that we'll look at in the next slide. And also Joshua Ragsdale, I don't know why they spelled that way, but it's Ragsdale for sure, was having a conversation with Chief Cornstalk, who was trying to tell him Cornstalk to divide his corn or his ground meal into 2 parts and put it across the horse in his saddlebags or whatever. But the Chief Cornstalk would not hear any such newfangled advice. And then it goes on to talk about how some of the Swank's children, and then they lived and died at old age in a comfortable home known then as Swanksville, near the location now of the town of Raccoon. So this was actually less than a mile southwest of Raccoon along the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad. And then this is a map that shows where Chief Cornstalk's village was. There's an historical marker in Parkersburg saying that Cornstalk's village was about 2 miles east of that. Very prominent. And he was very peaceful. Indian. I have another story about him and how he got here from West Virginia in a different presentation. It's very significant that we have documentation if he's having an actual conversation with a settler. Another one. This is now 1938. Just Newcastle platted in 1929, one of the county's ghost towns, already in 1938. So 120 years later, it's already a ghost town. Let's zoom in on this one. And we'll see that this reporter is saying that one hot afternoon, he took the county sheriff, John Sutherland, to Old Newcastle along the original Crawfordsville-Greencastle Road, again emphasizing that this road that went through Swanksville was the only north-south road in the county, or in the central part of the county at least. That's the only way you can get from Crawfordsville to Greencastle, going right through Blakesburg, Cairo, and Swanksville, saying that that road passed directly through Old Newcastle. Some person may have heard of Newcastle under its other name, Swanksville, the latter apparently having been the choice of the post office department. Then it goes on, says, Newcastle is one of the ghost towns in the county platted in deed record A, as I mentioned earlier, in the office of the county recorder on March 16, 1829 by David Swank. And again, they're saying he was also the postmaster there later, but we never could find that in the primary source documentation. And this legal description matches the land patent that we were looking at a few minutes ago. Then goes on to say, if you can get to this place by going up what was then State Road 43, going out a private drive, which is the drive of that White House we're talking about at the Skillman Cemetery, and you go down a hillside. You go down this hillside, you can clearly see the road as you go down this hillside toward Raccoon Creek. Then they said they had a way to cross the creek. And then they, at that time, even though it's 100 years later, they could apparently see remnants of the old mill and the race for the mill. And then they talk about going across Big Walnut on the old Stagecoach Road. Again, that's the road we've been talking about, the only road that you could get to from Greencastle to Crawfordsville at the time. And then they're saying there's yet a trace of the mill along the waters of Big Raccoon. And then a pond further upstream by the side of which the old Swank Mill was located. The Swank home near the town site has finally disappeared. And then also noted that he's talking to Sheriff Sutherland, who is a descendant of the La Follettes. There's a La Follette cemetery a little bit north of Swanksville down a long lane as you go west off the road. So he would have, Sutherland then, would have heard about Swanksville from his ancestors. They would have remembered it when they were alive. And again, in their elder age, they would have described it to him. And then they're talking a little bit more about the roadway and so forth. And also, this is very significant. They're talking about this road continues south to a point just south of Brick Chapel, where it meets up with what they then called State Road 43, now US 231. And I can show you that point. I can show you where that road met up, and it's a little bit west of the current 231. There's another article from 1942 saying the first boundary lines of the county were different. The boundaries of the counties changed about 5 times. We'll talk about that a different time. But zooming in on this, we're going to see that they said in 1822 now, David Swank acquired the land on the eastern edge of Russell Township, of where he established Swanksville, which later became the post office. Again, they're saying that Mr. Swank was a postmaster, but we never found that. And then here again, they're saying this tradition that he loaded the post office in a wagon and took it north to the big spring at Parkersburg, where Parkersburg is now located. We talked about this earlier. But again, he's saying 1822. So 1820, late 1820, 1821, maybe as late as 1820, but it's clearly documented that he was the first settler in Russell Township. So if it was not 1820, it was very soon thereafter. And now here's another possible lost town. As we did the research of Swanksville, we noticed a few other things came up. It says this Daily Banner, 1939, talks about a community called Frankfort, also platted in 1829, and also in Plat Book A, where Newcastle was platted, which became Swanksville. Let's look at this newspaper. We're going to zoom in, and we see deed record A, a town of Frankfort in Putnam County. Some people have read this and see that part of this newspaper was shaded out. I read this as Franklin, but no, it's Frankfort. They note it again down here, and then again later, clearly Frankfort. They're talking about it being north of Swanksville, a big Raccoon Creek, rest of the present town of Raccoon. So that's all we have.